Hello students, I am Dr. Saleha Jamal, Faculty Department of Geography, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. Welcome you all in today's class. So here we are again with the course Climate Change, Vulnerability and Adaptation, and today's topic of discussion is vulnerability of resources to the climate change. In previous classes we have discussed about different types of vulnerabilities, that is physical vulnerability to climate change, economic vulnerability to climate change, social vulnerability to the climate change. In today's class, we are going to discuss about the vulnerability of resources to the climate change, how climate change is impacting certain resources. So, before starting how the climate is impacting certain resources, we should have the concept about what the resource is. In very simple words, the resource can be defined as anything that can be used that play certain function, operation in order to satisfy the needs of the human being. So anything which satisfies our needs, that will be resource. If certain thing is not having any function and even we don't know for what purpose it is used or for what function it plays, then it will not be regarded as a resource. For example, until and unless uranium, thorium, their use was not known, that was not the resource, but when their use came in the nuclear energy and all, now it became the huge resource. So for a thing to become a resource, there should be always certain function should be placed by that particular thing in order to satisfy human need, or we can say human related needs. So anything that can be used to satisfy a need is a resource, and resources can be categorized into two broad categories, that is natural resource and human resource. What are the human resource? Wherever you can find the human imprints, those are regarded as human resource. Maybe in the built up structure, certain institutions, organization, and the human resource can be measured, can be quantified into numbers, and even the human resource can be of descriptive nature. So actually wherever you can find the human imprints, that is known as a human resource. And if we talk about the natural resource, that is again classified into renewable, and non-renewable resources. When we talk about renewable resources, these are resources whose supply is continued, and will be continued. For example, we can talk about the wind resource, water resource, etc. So this is what the continuous flow of these resources is generally maintained, that is known as renewable resource. Again, we can say in renewable resource we have the biological resources. In biological resources we can have the natural vegetation, flora, fauna. These are all what biological resources that can be counted under the renewable resource. Then another type of natural resource is non-renewable resource. Here non-renewable resource where the continuous supply is not maintained, which cannot be renewed back. Once it is finished, it will be totally finished. Or even we can say if it is renewed, the replacement level is so low that it cannot be compared with the exploitation or use of certain resource level compared to the replacement level. So actually its continuity will break. So the resource which cannot be renewed, that those resources are known as non-renewable resources. But in that too, we have the category. One is the resource that is non-recyclable, that cannot be used again and again, and once it is finished, it will be finished, or rate of replacement is very low. And another type of non-renewable resource is recyclable. We have non-recycle and recyclable resources. For example, the fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, coal, these are what? These are the non-recyclable resource. One, it is used, it will be used, it cannot be recycled. But in non-renewable resources, there are certain resources which can be recycled. For example, metals, it can be recycled again and again. So these are what? These are the all we can say are different types of resources. Now, why we are studying different types of resources? Because different types of resources are impacted by the climatic change events in different ways. So, actually the vulnerability of resources to the climate change is the likelihood, or we can say the degree to which a resource is likely to be negatively impacted by the climate change. When we talk about vulnerability of resources to the climate change, it means what are the likelihood of negative impacts that resource will face. That is known as vulnerability of resources, and it is generally can be measured or can be seen in terms of the various components. The major ones are the exposure, the sensitivity, and the adaptive capacity. When we talk about the exposure, the rate and amount of change a resource experiences from the direct and indirect climatic change impact. Exposure, how much it is exposed to, because certain resources are more exposed and certain resources are less exposed. For example, there are various resources which are climate sensitive resources. For example, if we talk about the marine resources, they are the climate sensitive resources. Fisheries, they are the climate sensitive resources. If we are talking about the natural vegetation, if we are talking about the agriculture, they are what? They are the climate sensitive resources. So, the rate and amount of change that a resource may undergo or experience from the direct or indirect climatic change impact is the exposure of that particular resource. When we talk about the sensitivity, that depends upon the resource characteristics. What is the resource characteristics? How much it is sensitive to the particular type of climatic event, whether it is more affected by the changes in the rainfall pattern, whether it is more affected by the changes in the temperature pattern, whether it is more impacted by the sea level rise, means it is the resource characteristics. And these resource characteristics will always depend upon the environmental condition, because certain forest, if the particular forest is in tropical, subtropical region which is having a prolonged dry condition, then they will be more vulnerable to the wildfires as compared to the forest which are in humid conditions. So, here we can say the resource characteristics can be defined upon the specific environmental condition in which the resources are present. Thus, the sensitivity defines how likely it will be affected by the climate change. I have already said some resources are more likely to be affected by the climatic change as compared to the others. Then third component comes here, the adaptive capacity. If we talk about the adaptive capacity, is the ability of the resource to cope up with the conditions. And how the resources will cope up with the conditions? Through the local and regional adaptation, or even through the migration and evolution. For example, the Siberian birds during the winter season, because of extreme low temperature or extreme cold, the Siberian birds, they migrate to the warmer regions, tropical and subtropical regions. So, migration is what? The adaptation for them to survive. So, actually adaptive capacity can be defined by the ability of the resource to cope up with the changing conditions, and that ability may be through the local and regional adaptation, may be through the evolution, may be through the migration, or we can say more of the things. So, climate change significantly impacts all the resources, making them more vulnerable. But some of the key resources which are more climate sensitive, we are going to discuss them only. We know nowadays the climate change is impacting all the resources, because all type of resources is exposed to the climate change. So all the resources will be impacted. But what I have said, we are going to discuss here some of the key resources which are more climate sensitive. For example, we may here talk about the water resource. Why we are talking here about the water resource? Because climate can change whole of the hydrological cycle. Means it can alter the precipitation patterns, leading to somewhat in some places drought condition, in some other places the flood situation. So this we can say it is a very much climate sensitive resource. In this, climate change can change the precipitation pattern, leading to the prolonged drought in some places havoc due to the floods, etc. Even these resources can be also affected in terms of the availability of the fresh water, which will certainly impact the agriculture, the water needed for the irrigation purpose, drinking water supplies, and due to which certain ecosystems will be affected. There are lots of examples about the water scarcities in different places. So this is a very important and climate sensitive resource, I can say here. Here you can see the flood situation, here you can see the drought situation. So it can bring both. Another key resource which is climate sensitive is agricultural productivity. This sector is very much dependent upon the climate. So any sort of changes that if in climate will happen, that will affect the agricultural productivity. For example, agriculture is very much dependent upon the temperature, rainfall, and rise in temperature or erratic rainfall can reduce the crop production, can reduce the yield, which may lead to food crisis, food shortage, and also rise in the prices of the food crops. Many times the growing season and the harvesting season also shifts due to the climate change. This also impacts the yield. Certain weather events like hurricanes, tornadoes, heat waves, they also destroy the crops and thus disrupting the food supply chains. So this is also a very much key resource which is affected directly by the climatic changes. Next comes here the biodiversity. We know biodiversity, that is whole soul, it is totally exposed to the climatic changes. So any type of change in climate, that will be reflected from the biodiversity. Biodiversity is what? Simply variability in the species, whether we are talking about the flora, fauna, etc. So now in the era of climate change, what we see, many of the species are facing habitat loss in which they are living. For example, due to the deforestation. Forest is what? It provides habitat for various species, not only to the flora but also to the fauna of that place. So many species are nowadays facing the habitat loss, mainly due to the some anthropogenic activities, and many times due to the natural events like climatic shifts can lead to habitat loss, leading to the decline in the biodiversity. This type of loss destabilizes the ecosystems, and finally it reduces the resilience of the natural system. That was, we can, if suppose the forest cover is reduced, the reason may be any, whether deforestation, whether wildfires or shift of the, we can say, habitat due to the climate changes. If the forest cover is reduced, certainly the habitat for the various species will be lost. That is what we can say, biodiversity loss. Another important resource, key resource, which is directly impacted by the climatic changes are the forest. As we know, in many of my lectures, I have already told that forests are the natural sink of the carbon. They store carbon. Mainly they use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere for the photosynthesis purpose. If any changes reduce in the forest cover takes place, it means the level of carbon dioxide will increase in the atmosphere, and this increased level of carbon dioxide will lead to greenhouse effect, and this greenhouse effect will lead to global warming, which will again impact the forest of the different place. So it is all what it is, somewhat we can say these are all interlinked system. So increased, if you are talking about the increased temperature, the changing precipitation regimes that generally make the forest more susceptible to the pest, because high temperature and humid condition leads to the breeding place of various types of pest, etc. So thus with these changes in the temperature condition, precipitation condition, the forest areas, the forest covers become more susceptible to the pest, disease, wildfire, threatening the timber resources and the economy dependent upon these timber resources, and also it affects the carbon storage because it is one of the natural carbon storage or natural carbon sink, we can say. Another important resource which is affected by the climate change are the coastal resources. We know due to the global warming, the ice cap, the ice sheets and the glaciers are melting, due to which the sea level is rising, which is threatening our coastal ecosystem. Like we can take example, it is affecting the mangroves vegetation, the coral reefs. These ecosystems provide various resources and various services to the certain other ecosystems or the species like fisheries. They also, like if we talk about coral reefs, nowadays due to the rise in temperature, warming of ocean water is taking place. Due to the acidification of ocean water, what is happening, the coral polyps which builds up the coral reefs, they expel their algae which lives in their tissue, and that becomes white, which is known as coral bleaching. Now actually these bleached corals, these are what they become more susceptible, more vulnerable to the climate change. Why these coral reefs are important? Coral reefs, they provide habitat to various other types of species. They provide spawning ground for various other aquatic species. They provide food for the smaller fishes. So if they are destroyed, then we can say the other species which are dependent upon this, they will be also impacted. Similarly, if we are taking the example of mangrove vegetation, that we can say rising sea level is threatening mangrove vegetation. So what actually mangrove vegetation, they provide natural bunding, we can say, or we can say natural obstruction to the storm surges or to the flooding. That's why protecting the coastal, that's how protecting the coastal areas. So these coastal resources are also very much climate sensitive. You can explain these climate sensitive coastal resources through these two very good example, that is mangrove resource, and we can also explain it through the coral reefs. Now various energy resources, if you are talking about, now the changes in the climate affects the energy production, particularly the hydropower and the solar energy. We know the hydro production of the hydropower need continuous supply of the water if there are changes in the precipitation regime. Similarly, the solar energy requires continuous supply of solar energy if there is lots of cloud formation, we can say, or due to the shifts in the sunshine pattern, and also due to the shifts in the water availability, this may be restricted. That's why we can say changes in climate affect energy production, particularly hydropower and solar energy. Increasing temperature would result in increasing electricity demand, mainly for the coolers and the ACs, but the climate change can negatively impact on the other hand side the hydropower. On one hand side, due to the increasing temperature, electricity demand is increasing for the cooling purposes, but on the other hand, due to these climatic changes which impacts the hydropower, which relies on stable rainfall patterns, that is also restricted. So there is lot of stress we can see on the energy resources. In the similar way, solar power is suitable option, but solar farms require substantial surface area, which is the main issue for the large scale plant. So actually the energy resources are being impacted through the changes in the climate. Not only that, the human, if we are talking about the human health, vulnerable population faced increased health risk from what may be the vulnerable population, all having the pre-existing already having the pre-existing health issues, maybe pre-existing cardiovascular issues, maybe pre-existing respiratory issues. So this type of vulnerable population, they will be at more risk from the heat waves, or whether we can say from poor air quality, waterborne diseases, which will impact workforce productivity and of the healthcare system. Now we can say increased risk of respiratory and heart diseases, or even we can say waterborne diseases. These all things increases among the population who are already vulnerable. Vulnerable in terms of the health issues, vulnerable in terms of the social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, etc. The events, more frequent events like we can say storms, floods, droughts, even the wildfires, these can increase also the injury and the health. Thus, it is impacted. Like climate change leads to increased hunger and poor nutrition, mainly in the areas which is affected by the drought and we cannot grow enough food. So those areas will lead to increased hunger rate and poor nutrition. Another example, you can take rising temperature. The rising temperature, decreasing precipitation, that will also lead to ozone formation on the ground, and that will impact the respiratory health. So that is also we can say a direct impact you can see on the health through the climate changes. So the health impacts of climate change, that may vary in different population in different regions, depending upon the certain factors such as what type of existing vulnerability and adaptive capacity of the population is. Now fisheries, it is another one of the key resource which is very much climate sensitive. We know that ocean warming is taking place, acidification of ocean is taking place, and demand due to high population, demand is increasing. That's why overfishing is going on. So the fisheries are one of the stressed marine resource leading to the decline in the fish stock, the rise in temperature, the acidification and over exploitation or overfishing. These are what reducing the fishing stocks, impacting the livelihoods of the people who are dependent for food and for their economy both. Examples you can take here: fisheries decline. Many fish species are moving to the cooler waters due to the change in the temperature regimes, due to the rising temperature, which is what disrupting the traditional fishing areas, thus threatening the livelihoods of the coastal communities, because the fishes are moving to the cooler places because the temperature of ocean water, sea water is rising. Similarly, coral reef ecosystem. Already I have talked about the coral bleaching. Simply when the corals turns white, why they turns white? Due to the acidification, we can say, due to rise in ocean temperature, they expel their algae from their tissue and turns white. That is known as coral bleaching. So coral bleaching from warmer water and acidification, that will harm fish population because various small fishes are dependent on that, and thus the health of the marine ecosystem will be disturbed. Not only this, due to the coral bleaching, or we can say due to the ocean acidification, the shellfish and the aquaculture, generally due to the ocean acidification, the weakening of the shells of the shellfish occurs, not only for the shellfish but various other calcifying organisms which depend upon this calcium carbonate. The weakening of the shells occurs, which affects the aquaculture and the marine biodiversity. You can see here the diagrammatic representation how warming water will leave fish gasping for air and shrinking in size. Even there are various external and internal factors which work together and affects the fisheries. So these are some of the key resources which are climate sensitive. There are various, what I have said, the climate change is impacting all types of resources. But the vulnerability will differ because some are the key resources which are directly impacted and some are indirectly impacted. So addressing these vulnerabilities requires a proactive adaptation strategies. One, we have to identify what are the threats, what are the problems, then only we can use certain proactive adaptation strategies. We can proceed for the sustainable management practices and mainly the policies which should be aimed at mitigating climate change impacts. If we talk about the resource depletion, it refers to the exhaustion of the natural resources due to the overconsumption, due to the environmental degradation, due to the unsustainable practices. Resource depletion simply means exhaustion of the resources. Now, the exhaustion of the resources are due to the various factors. Maybe we are over consuming the resources, over exploiting the resources, maybe due to the certain changes in the environment, maybe due to the climate change, and maybe also due to the unsustainable practices. So nowadays all the policies are generally based on sustainable practices, that is known as sustainable management. So climate change exacerbates the resource depletion by altering the ecosystem. If you can say certain impacts here through the global warming, temperature rise is taking place. We can say, which is one of the example already we have taken, that the ocean water is warming, natural resources are depleting, acid rain is occurring due to the climate change, that is simply a lots of human activities is releasing different types of oxides of sulfur and oxides of nitrogen in the atmosphere, and when precipitation occurs it combines with this difference of oxides and it forms acid, which is known as acid rain, which impacts the ecosystem, not only the terrestrial ecosystem but the aquatic ecosystem a lot. So waste disposal has another repercussions. Overpopulation, demand of the resources are increasing. Due to the overpopulation, resources are stressed, they are over consumed, they are over exploited, thus the resource depletion is taking place. Air pollution has another impact on the health issues and all. Then water pollution, waterborne diseases and all, that is not only impacting the agriculture, vegetation, but also impacting the health of the human. Ozone depletion leading to the inception of harmful rays on the earth's surface, impacting the human population, and destruction of the forest. Actually, the destruction of the forest is the destruction of the carbon sink, which will ultimately lead to the global warming. So here we can analyze that these are the few of the climate change that will exacerbate the resource depletion. So climate change's impacts are discernible on the various resources as discussed. If we are talking about the water resource, changing precipitation pattern, prolonged droughts and increased evaporation rate due to the higher temperature will reduce to the fresh water availability, that may be exacerbating or increasing the water scarcity in many regions. If evaporation rate will increase, or we can say precipitation pattern will be erratic. So certainly it will lead to reduction in fresh water availability, due to which water scarcity we are facing in many of the region. Not only this, groundwater depletion, over extraction of groundwater for the irrigation purpose, for the industrial purpose, or we can say increased demand of water during the dry periods, along with the over extraction for the agricultural purpose or even for the urban use. This will lead to long term depletion of the aquifers if it is not properly recharged. Then that can impact the water availability for the drinking purposes also, and as well as for the water supply also. Not only this, quality degradation also takes place for the, because flooding at different places due to the erratic rainfall patterns, heavy rainfall, that will lead to runoff, that these runoff from the agricultural field and different types of areas, that will contaminate fresh water sources with certain pollutants, further degrading the water quality of those areas or those water bodies, thus reducing the availability for the human consumption and agriculture. Soil and agricultural resources, soil degradation takes place through the accelerated soil erosion, nutrient depletion and salinization. Global warming will lead to higher rate of evaporation. Higher rate of evaporation, water is evaporated and salt is left behind. So that will lead to salinization, a sort of degradation, soil degradation. So these all things will negatively affect the soil health. Not only this, if we are talking about the heavy rainfall, that will wash away the top organic soil, that will lead to the infertility in the soil. Similarly, crop yields, changes in the temperature pattern, precipitation pattern, which will lead to the reduction in the crop yields. Many times there are alteration in the growing season due to the shift of climate, that also threatens the food security. Not only this, increased incidence of pests and diseases are now felt at different places due to the warmer temperature, and also which leads to the proliferation of pest and disease. So these are the few factors we can say. Not only this, forest and biodiversity. If we are talking about the deforestation, increased frequency of wildfires, droughts, pests coupled with logging and land use changes leads to deforestation, which is not only impacting or reducing the forest cover, but it is also reducing the place, or we can say carbon sink. Due to this deforestation, it leads to the habitat loss for the various species, due to which loss of biodiversity also take place. Many times alteration in the habitats also take place, which disrupts the ecosystem, leading to the species extinctions also. Due to the climate change, forest health also decline. Changes in temperature and precipitation can stress forest ecosystem, making them more prone to certain diseases and pests. Not only this, marine resources are depleting very fast due to the overfishing, due to the high demand of the increasing population. The fishes are moving to the cooler places due to the warming of the oceans, which is altering the fish distribution and traditional grounds of the fishing, thus affecting the fishing communities. Not only this, coral reef degradation is going on due to the warming of the oceans plus the acidification of the oceans, due to the coral bleaching is taking place, and which is impacting other marine species, and overall it is impacting the marine ecosystem. Similarly, if we talk about the altered marine ecosystem, changes in the temperature and salinity can impact highly the marine species breeding and migration patterns of the marine species. So these are the direct impact we can see. Similarly, the impacts directly and indirectly in the mineral depletion can be seen. For example, resource extraction. Climate change can impact the availability of the minerals and metals by affecting the mining operations, because during the mining operations, extreme heat waves, weather events, flooding, landslide, these all can disrupt the mining activities, and thus it can reduce the resource availability. Not only this, according to the increased environmental regulations, if we talk about awareness that is increasing regarding the climate change, more strict regulations are coming on the mining resource extraction, and that if they will be implemented strictly, they will limit the access to the certain resources. Shifts in demand are generally seen nowadays in the era of climate change, because lots of transitioning to a low carbon economy is going on, which will increase the demand of specific minerals which are environment friendly, maybe the lithium, cobalt, etc., that is used in renewable energy technologies. Means if the transitioning is going to a low carbon economy, a different types of minerals resources are required, their demand will increase, and thus depletion in those resources can be seen. Due to this we can say resource depletion due to the climate change, certain economic and social impacts can be seen. Like economic, if we assess the economic losses, the resource depletion due to the climate change can lead to various type of economic losses, mainly in the climate sensitive sectors like agriculture, forestry, fishery, lumbering, tourism, etc. As these are the climate sensitive sectors, so the most economic losses due to the climate change can be seen in these sectors. Not only this, it will also impact the social inequality, as we know that the vulnerable communities mainly depend upon the primary sector of economy, mainly depend upon the natural resources for their livelihood, so they will be most affected by the climate change, leading to the increased poverty and many times displacement, migration, etc. Not only this, due to the resource depletion, scarcity in various resources can be seen. For example, in arable, scarcity in arable land, scarcity in the water resources, due to which the resource conflict may arise and which may further complicate the social dynamics, thus exacerbating the vulnerabilities. So, these are all what about we can say the vulnerability of resources to the climate change. One thing to remember in last year student, the climate change will impact all the resources, because we know all the resources are exposed to the climate change, but their rate of affect how they are affecting the particular resources, the rate for the different resources will be different, because certain resources are climate sensitive as compared to the other. So, climate sensitive resources will be impacted more, but all the resources are impacted either directly or indirectly through the events or through the negative impacts of the climate change. Thank you. That's all for the today's class. Have a nice day.